Okay, welcome to part 2. So now we're going to review chapter 6, 7, and 8. So chapter 6 is probably one of the more difficult chapters in the course. It is our chapter on learning. And of course, learning is the nurture in the nature-nurture debate. So learning is any relatively durable change in behavior, attitude, or knowledge that is due to experience. And that's where the nurture part comes in. So it's the idea that we can become who we are as a result of our experiences. And we want to make sure that we understand that things that are reflexes, so we're born with many reflexes and instinctual responses, those are controlled by the peripheral nervous system and as a result are not considered to be learned but are rather considered to be innate. So the first thing we studied was uh, uh, classical conditioning. And classical conditioning, it's very important to understand that the thing that sets it apart from other types of learning is that it is not voluntary. Okay, so what happens is before conditioning, we may have a neutral stimulus, such as a bell. And in Pavlov's famous study, before conditioning, the bell was neutral and did not cause any salivation on the part of the dog. However, during conditioning, Pavlov associated the sound of a bell with the presentation of food. So through many pairings, um, the conditioning occurred. So it's important to note that the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, causes the unconditioned response, which is the salivation. So again, this we don't have any control over this. So salivation happens. Um, it's a physiological response, and it happens upon the presentation of food. And so during conditioning, we pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditional stimulus, and over time, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. And so what happens is that the bell alone can produce the response of salivation. And so now we have the conditioned stimulus, the bell, which can produce the conditioned response, the salivation. And it actually makes a lot of sense. So if if someone rang a bell at dinner time every day in your home, you would come to know that that bell is associated with dinner, and you would probably start to salivate as well. So it does make sense. The classical conditioning. So again, the key is that we don't have control over the salivation response. It is not voluntary, it is conditioned. So that's why we call it respondent conditioning, because it's to do with conditioned responses. And it occurs because of the repeated association of two or more different stimuli. And so we see that learning has occurred when a particular stimulus that was neutral can now consistently produce a response that it did not previously produce. So in classical conditioning, a response that is automatically produced by one stimulus becomes associated or linked with another stimulus that would not normally produce this response. So the food gets paired with the bell. The food automatically produces the salivation, but through repeated associations with the bell eventually can produce the salivation as well. And here's another example of classical conditioning. A bright light causes the unconditional response of blinking. And a camera is a neutral stimulus early in our lives before we've experienced having our picture taken, and it does not cause us to blink. But then through repeated associations with the flash and the camera, we become used to the idea that cameras are associated with the flash. And because of that association, over time, the presentation of the camera alone can cause blinking. And if you just have to look at family photos to see this, that frequently, even before the flash, or even when in the absence of flash, you'll find various people in the family portrait that are blinking. And this, of course, is because of classical conditioning. So here's an example that we talked about. Jerry's wife Mary gets new nightwear which she wears when she's in the mood. After a month, the sight of the nightwear alone on a hanger is enough to excite Jerry. So initially the neutral stimuli is the nightwear. Nightwear is not something that by itself causes excitement. Um, but of course, having your partner be in the mood, that would be our UCS. Our UCS is our partner being in the mood. And the UCR is that when our partner is in the mood, that also causes a response in ourselves. So that's natural. The conditioned stimulus becomes the nightwear. So because Mary wears it every time she's in the mood, that becomes a trigger. And the conditioned response is, of course, Jerry is excited. So the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, is Mary being excited. The unconditioned response is Jerry becomes excited. And then over time, the conditioned stimulus becomes that nightwear. And then the conditioned response are the same. So you want to remember that the UCR and the CR are always the same, and so that can be helpful when we're trying to identify it. So I'm going to leave these ones for you guys to try. And if you're unsure about the answers, just send me an email. So there's a couple there for you to try. And this is very similar to the exercise, an exercise that will be on the exam. So it's a good idea to try these out on your own. And if you're not sure, just send me a text or a message and I will let you know if you got the right answers. So we also kind of looked at some evolutionary perspectives on classical conditioning. So it appears that particularly in relation to food, classical conditioning is evolutionary, and we know this because we can learn about foods after one trial. So typically classical conditioning requires many trials before the conditioned stimulus can invoke the conditioned response. But with food aversion, we can have that learning with just one trial. So one trial learning involves a change in behavior that occurs with only one powerful experience, and this is very common with taste aversion. So if we eat something and we become very ill, we can develop a conditioned aversion to that food item that can last many, many years. And so that suggests that there is a biological mechanism at work, that it's not just learning, that there's some innate something innate going on. And then we also talked about how some phobias are much more easily conditioned than others, suggesting that we're actually biologically prepared to develop those phobias. So although electrical sockets are extremely dangerous, as we see in this picture, we tend to develop phobias to snakes. Because we are biologically prepared to do so, and that's because of the fact that our ancestors, if they were afraid of snakes, they probably were more likely to survive. So after classical conditioning, we want to move on to operant conditioning, and ABCs help us to remember the different aspects of operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is basically it's a selective rewarding or punishing of desired or undesired behaviors. And antecedent is kind of what's going on in the environment at the time that the behavior is chosen by the actor. The key difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning is in operant conditioning we see voluntary behavior. So there's something going on in the environment, and we choose a behavior based on what's going on in the environment, and then we are either rewarded for that behavior or we are punished. Okay, so we can have a whole bunch of things going on in the environment, but these are some examples. So we might in a specific environment, we might ask someone to do a behavior. So for example, we might ask our child to take out the garbage. And of course, a desired behavior would be that they would comply with that request. And if they did, likely they would receive positive reinforcement. We can also ask our child to take out the garbage, and they can choose not to. And typically, that would result in some form of punishment. Another antecedent in the environment can be modeling. So someone can choose a behavior because someone else is doing it. And that can result in desired or undesired behavior. So we talked about the hockey riots after the Stanley Cup in Vancouver a few years ago. And a lot of undesired behaviors were a result of some modeling that was currently going on in the environment. Sometimes the environment, we may choose behavior based on feedback. So imagine that someone is teaching you something, and they're teaching, maybe someone is teaching you to drive, and so they're giving you feedback. They're going to say, okay, when you go to make a left turn, get into the turn lane and turn your signal on, and proceed when it's safe. So you've gotten some feedback, and then you get a little bit nervous and you forget to turn on your left turn signal. So that would be an undesired behavior, and then you would get some more feedback as a result of that. So the ABCs help us to remember that operant conditioning is about the antecedent, what's going on in the environment, the behavior we choose. So again, key is choice, and then the consequences of that behavior. And then this really shows that chain. So I say to the dog, sit. The dog sits, and the dog gets a cookie. So the prompt, the correct behavior, and the reward. So prompt, correct behavior, and the reward. If I say sit and the dog lies down, then of course the dog would not receive the reward. So here's some examples of some behaviors that have been positively reinforced. And we're not seeing the antecedent here, but recognize that there is an antecedent. So for example, the antecedent for our first behavior might be that we have decided to go out for dinner. So we've said, okay, let's go out for dinner. And as a result of that antecedent, we choose to go to Elmo's Diner. And we have a great meal. And so that great meal, it acts as a reward. And because we've been rewarded by having a great meal, we are more likely to go to Elmo's Bistro next time. So again, that doesn't mean we're always going to go to Elmo's, but the reward increases the tendency. So we're always talking about probabilities in operant conditioning. And then another one, again here we talked about this, the antecedent might be, I'm feeling a little nervous at a party. So I tell a joke. And when I tell a joke, my friends laugh. And so what that's going to do is it's going to increase the likelihood that I will tell a joke next time I'm in a similar situation. So it increases the tendency. So positive reinforcement is a reward, and it increases the likelihood that you'll choose that same behavior again. So shaping is a way that we can work towards very complex behavior. So behavior is very complex. It's not just telling the dog to sit. So we can use operant conditioning to guide behavior closer and closer towards more complex behavior. So we see here how we're rewarding the dolphin for coming out of the water. Here we're going to reward the dolphin for doing the opening his fins, and then we're going to do a reward for combining those two behaviors. So that is shaping. I just want to go back here and just to again give you a tip that you want to be able to come up with your own unique examples of positive reinforcement. Okay, so make sure that not ones like this, but where you can come up with examples. And again, if you're wondering if your examples are on the right track, you can certainly send them to me. So you need to be able to provide your own unique examples of the effects of positive reinforcement on your behavior. Here's an example of shaping. So of course potty training is quite a complex behavior, and so this would be, we'd start off, I take down my pants by myself. So then you'd give a sticker for all of those, and then when you reward again for sitting on the potty, and then a big reward for going, and so on. So this shows shaping for potty training. And of course, we want to know that stickers are a form of secondary reinforcement, so that maybe once the child had filled up their sticker chart, they would get a special treat like an ice cream. So a reinforcer is any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. And we're going to review in just a minute that we have positive and negative reinforcers. So they're events that strengthen the behavior. We've got our weightlifter here to remind us, that's our visual, that the reinforcer strengthens the behavior. And there's two types, positive and negative. So positive reinforcement strengthens the response by presenting a very pleasant stimulus after a response. So a hug is an example, receiving some money, and here kissing your boyfriend because they brought you a rose. So these are all examples of positive reinforcement. Okay, so another word for positive reinforcement is reward. So positive reinforcement is reward. And negative reinforcement, this strengthens the response by reducing or removing completely something unpleasant. And the big word to remember negative reinforcement is relief. It's relief. So you're really, really hot and you get out the fan and you stand in front of the fan and you experience relief from the heat. And so this relief from the heat is going to make it more likely that you'll get out the fan next time it's hot. I can't remember what this one was. We're going to skip this one. But this is our felon. He's in jail, and while he's in jail, he chooses to be a model prisoner. So he chooses this behavior, being a model prisoner, and as a result, he gets out of jail sooner. And of course, getting out of jail is a removal of a very aversive stimulus. So he's more likely, if he happens to get back into jail again, to be a model citizen, model prisoner. So the key word for negative reinforcement is relief. Okay, so when you want to increase a response, those are your reinforcements. So we got our R's here. So reinforcements, positive reinforcement is reward. Okay, so we got the two R's of reinforcement, and negative reinforcement is relief. So it's relief from a very unpleasant. Another really good example of negative reinforcement is we talked about kind of what you do when you have a headache. So if you have a headache, you guys had listed many great strategies. So we looked at maybe taking Advil, doing some relaxation, massaging the temples, drinking some water. Those are all behaviors. And if one of those behaviors causes your headache to go away, then you will get relief from the headache. And so the behavior that caused that relief is more likely to be repeated next time you have a headache. Okay, so next time you have a headache, you'll choose the drinking the water, taking an Advil, massaging your temples, whichever behavior worked. And so that's negative reinforcement. So it's really important to remember these two words, because the most common error that people make is that they think that negative reinforcement is punishment. And it is not. It is relief. Relief from something unpleasant. Now we've got our two P's for punishments. So we either have reinforcements, which increase a behavior, or we have punishments, which decrease a behavior. So we can either have punishment, which is actively doing something unpleasant. So the most common one in child rearing is spanking or yelling, scolding. So those are active punishments. And then there's also penalties, and penalties is the removal of privileges. And again, this is more common with older children when it's no longer effective to use the punishment. So the two R's of reinforcement, reward and relief, and the two P's of punishment, punishment and penalty. And here's a chart that kind of shows it. So we've got our two green ones that increase behavior, the reward and relief, and our two blue ones that decrease behavior. So we want to recognize that when we look at reinforcers, there are primary reinforcers and secondary. So the primary ones are the ones that are innately satisfying. So food, water, sex, and in my opinion, affection. So they put affection down here, but I think we have a biological need for affection. So I would put affection as a primary reinforcer. So there's a little bit of debate by that. And secondary are things like money, grades, and in some cases approval. So I'd put approval and praise definitely in the secondary reinforcer category, but affection I would put in the primary reinforcer. So when we're raising children and we give them our love and attention and affection when they do new behaviors like walking or talking, I think that's a primary reinforcer. So primary reinforcers are those innately reinforcing stimulus. So we've got a good one here, and then we've got a very negative one here. So this would be one where we would get relief if we got relief from the like being shocked, and then we get a reward from sugar. And then the secondary reinforcer, it gains power from its association with a primary reinforcer. Okay, so the last part of the puzzle of learning is observational learning. And so observational learning was a real revolution in learning theory, because learning theorists thought that we had to actually do something in order to learn, but observational learning is the idea that we can learn from observing others. So thank goodness. There's this great song I've been listening to by Eric Church, and it's called "I Wish I Didn't Have to Learn That the Hard Way." So fortunately, we don't have to learn everything in life the hard way. We can learn through watching others. And so in this example here, we have a young girl who has been going with her father, so maybe 3 times now, going with her father as he buys a new car. And what she's able to observe is her father bargaining assertively with the car salesperson. And as a result of that, her father gets a good buy on a car. And so because she's had the opportunity to observe this cycle several times, when she goes to buy a car, the modeled response of bargaining assertively, she's more likely to do that. And a real interesting part of observational learning is the mirror neurons. So the discovery of mirror neurons has yielded important new insights into behavior. Mirror neurons are neurons that are activated by performing an action or by seeing another perform the same action. So that's so cool. The idea that the same neurons fire when we perform an action ourselves or when we simply watch another perform the same action. And so in monkeys and humans, neurons have been detected that respond in a similar way to your physical actions as when you're observing someone else do the activity. So the mirror neurons help to explain why observational learning is effective. And typically these mirror neurons are in the frontal lobes. And of course, mirror neurons are also responsible for a very important human condition called empathy. And empathy is when we are able to understand the experiences of others, which is different than sympathy. So sympathy is kind of when we experience the emotions that someone else, but empathy is when we have an understanding of what someone else may be experiencing. All right, so that's it for chapter 6. So we're going to move on to chapter 7. So make sure that you know Craig and Craig Larkhart's levels of processing theory. So there may be multiple choice questions. And so basically there are 3 types of processing. And so we're talking about encoding. So we know that human memory has 3 parts: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And so when we look at levels of processing, we are focusing on encoding. Okay, so if we do shallow processing, we're looking at the structural characteristics of a physical stimulus. So for example, is a word written in capital letters? When we do intermediate processing, we may get into the phonemic encoding, so emphasizing what words sound like. So does the word rhyme with weight? So again, this is pretty shallow. When we get into the deep processing, we actually get into the meaning of what we are trying to encode. So it emphasizes the meaning of verbal input. So would the word fit in the sentence, he met a blank on the street? So the more processing you do, the results in more durable memories. So memory is all about the quality of the encoding. And here's another view of that same. So most shallow, just looking at the appearance of something. A little bit less is the sounds, and then the deep, really looking at the meaning. Now we also looked at the multiple stores model of memory, and it's the idea that memory consists of 3 different storages. So sensory memory is a very, very brief echo. So the word echo is really good. It's a very, very brief echo that we store in our brain of sensory experiences. So we may if we just meet someone, we'll have a little echo of their name in our brain for a very short period of time, but if we don't rehearse that name, we're going to lose it. Okay, so we can maintain an echo of something that someone just said when we're not paying attention. So typically it is attention that takes stimuli from sensory memory into working or short-term memory. So we have a whole bunch of things that are entering our brain through our senses that we're not paying attention to. And so again, another great example is you're having a conversation with a friend and you very briefly tune out. Maybe you have a thought in your head. You're like, oh no, I have to study for my final exam. And while you're having that thought, your attention isn't on the conversation. But when you come back to the conversation, you'll have a little echo of what your friend was saying. And if it was important, you might say to them, what did you just say? Because you'll realize that they were saying something important. So we get information into our working or short-term memory by paying attention to it. And so the simple act of paying attention gets the information into our short-term memory, and we maintain the information in our short-term memory through rehearsal. If we rehearse the information effectively, it can be moved into long-term storage. And we talked about how the model of short-term memory became modified in the 70s through the work of Baddeley. And he came up with a much more elegant and complex view of working memory that included several different aspects. We also want to be aware that some information goes directly from sensory experience to long-term memory storage, and this is called automatic processing. Okay, so it's when memory goes directly from sensory to long-term. And one of the types of information that might do that would be a very emotional experience. So here's our sensory memory. It's a very brief recording of sensory information before it is processed into short-term working or long-term memory. If we don't pay attention to it, it's lost. Big capacity in our sensory memory, but very short duration. So very briefly, and it's like an echo. So 3 to 4 second echo, or a 1/20th of a second image. So 3 to 4 second echo, or 1/20th of a second for an image. Yeah, so evidence of auditory sensory memory called echoic memory can occur after someone says, "What did I just say?" Even if you weren't paying attention, you can retrieve about the last 8 words from your echoic memory. I've done that in a job interview where I was answering a question and then I was going to sum up and I forgot what I just said. So I had to take a minute and kind of replay it. So in our working memory, if we don't chunk, there's some good evidence that shows that we can maintain about 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So yeah, so 7 digits, 6 letters, or about 5 words. So this is about what we can hold on to. And that's, again, if we don't chunk it, if we don't make a rhyme, or if we don't put the letters together in some meaningful way. And so we tried it with the VM3 CAQ9LD, and you guys did an excellent job of being able to hold those into your short-term memory. So I want you guys to be able to think of a couple of effortful encoding strategies. So I want you to be able to describe, so again, that'll be a short answer question. I want you to be able to describe a couple of methods that enhance encoding. So for example, you might describe chunking, or you might describe the PEG system. Or you might describe how if you use hierarchies or put things into categories, you can remember better. So I want you to be able to describe a couple, so at least 2 encoding or effortful processing strategies. So you'll want to kind of make some notes on that for the exam. So when we do effortful processing, so when we enhance our encoding, it makes the memory much less likely to decay, and it also, of course, makes it easier to retrieve. Concept maps are another effortful processing strategy, so you can describe that, but you'll need to be able to describe a couple of different ones. And so chunking is the idea that we can take information and put it into meaningful categories. And here we've got the X, IDK for I don't know, KFC for Kentucky Fried Chicken. So when we chunk, we really increase our ability to remember longer lists of words. Another another great strategy is using imagery. Okay, so we can link information we need to know with some imagery. So some of you in your concept maps did some great little sketches, and that is awesome because that is increasing your likelihood that you're going to remember those concepts. So a mnemonic is a memory trick that connects information to existing memory strengths such as imagery or structure. So and we use the PEG word system. So we use the PEG word system to remember the names of the Academy Award winning films from 2001 to 2010. And likely you could still remember those because you connected to such a durable memory system. So it's very easy to remember one bun, two shoe. So that's an existing list, and then we can attach other things to it through the use of imagery. This is, as I mentioned last time, this is a very important visual for you guys to think about, and I will be asking you on the exam to compare and contrast implicit and explicit memory. And so I'd like you to focus on the content, and so this last row here is the content. So in the non-declarative or implicit memory, we have our classical conditioning. We also have all our motor and cognitive skills. So this is called procedural memory. And we have our awareness of space, time, and frequency. So where you were when you ate your dinner yesterday. So these are things that we can recall without conscious effort. And this is in terms of brain anatomy. So this row here is our brain anatomy. In terms of brain anatomy, the automatic memories, the implicit memories are processed in the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. So the cerebellum is really associated with our classical conditioning. Basal ganglia, very important for procedural memory. And then on the other side, we have our explicit memories. And these are the ones that require conscious recall. And so we have two types of explicit memory. So we have all of our knowledge about the world. And remember that another name for this is semantic memory. So semantic meaning knowledge, so meaning. So some examples of facts would be the concepts in this chapter. And then another explicit memory are our own personal memories. And the reason this is included in the effortful is that if we don't kind of review our memories periodically, they tend to decay. So if we don't continue to think about, kind of what we did, when we were in grade 5, for example, over time that memory will decay. But if we learned a new skill in grade 5, something that we learned, say when we were 10, maybe learn to ski. That would be something we might do when we're at that age. We're going to remember how to do that, and it won't require any effort. It might we might be a little bit rusty, but we'll be able to recover that skill. Okay, so you've got the automatic and the effortful. So make sure that you really understand this and that you can compare and contrast those two memory systems. And they're very distinct. Like I say, the automatic memories are processed in a very different part of the brain. Automatic memories are very resistant to amnesia. So we tend not to lose these memories even if we've had severe brain trauma. Alzheimer's patients tend not to lose these memories, so they're very, very different. Whereas our effortful, our explicit memories are quite vulnerable to amnesia, they're vulnerable to brain injury, and they're vulnerable to disease. So we know that people with Alzheimer's, they lose their general knowledge about the world, and they also lose their personal memories. And this is, of course, due to the fact that Alzheimer's causes damage to the hippocampus. Another interesting thing about effortful memory is that that effort continues when we're asleep. So what we know is that when we're sleeping, our brain is actually working on these memories, storing them in the hippocampus before sending them off to be stored in the frontal lobes. Our brain continues to work on these explicit memories as we sleep. And here's another way of looking at those two memory stores. So you've got the declarative, and that's divided into the semantic and the episodic, and we have the non-declarative. So our procedural memory system, so actions, perceptual motor skills, conditioned reflex, implicit memories. Okay, so two very similar. So make sure you know a little bit about the anatomy of memory, in particular that the hippocampus is responsible for declarative memory. So we have our episodic and semantic memory is consolidated in the hippocampus, and that just means it's organized, and then it gets sent out into the frontal lobe region. And you want to know that the cerebellum is very important for conditioned learning, and that's a very ancient part of our brain, sometimes called the little brain, and it is very important for conditioned learning. And also know that the amygdala, so the amygdala is associated with emotional memory. So the amygdala is a little knob at the end of the hippocampus. And it actually interacts with the hippocampus and to make those kind of flashbulb memories. So hippocampus, declarative, cerebellum, conditioned, and the amygdala, emotion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on chapter 8 because we're going to be reviewing that this week, but I just want to tell you what's going to be on the exam in relation to chapter 8. So fewer questions on the exam than the other chapters because it's going to be pretty close to the exam. I want you to know the developmental milestones of language, and we will be reviewing those on Monday. So kind of the timing, and we want to realize that these are norms, and so children vary considerably in how they reach these milestones, but these are what we call the norms. Very interesting fact about language development is children understand far more than what they can express. And so I'm seeing this in my grandchild right now. She's 18 months old, and she can understand everything we say, but she's not able yet to express. So she has excellent receptive language, but not much expressive language yet. And here's a few more. So we're going to be talking about these. So just you want to know these milestones. And this is a great chart. And it kind of shows the milestones. And the other thing that's really important is we're going to be reviewing this on Wednesday, but I want you to know some barriers to problem solving, and so you'll want to make some notes on this. And so we've got mental sets, functional fixedness, confirmation bias, availability bias, and the representative heuristic. So these are 5 things that you're going to want to take some notes on. And again, I'm not going to talk a lot about them because we haven't reviewed them yet. And that is it. Again, real quick, but just giving you some ideas of things to study.